So now let's dive right into Disney's Silver Age. Cinderella. So Cinderella came out in 1950 and it kicked off Disney's Silver Age of animation. And if you want to know more about Disney's Golden Age of animation, well, I've made videos on every one of the movies that came out during that time. And if you're wondering where my wartime era videos are, well, let me know if you want to see those because I may do that in the future. But for now, we're trucking right along with the Silver Age, starting with Cinderella, the greatest since Snow White, as it was called at the time. And it's hard to argue with them on that. And I think in some respects this may be better than Snow White, even though Snow White will always have a special place in my heart because it just was the first. It was the first full-length animated movie. And it was such a big leap forward in the art of animation, and nobody can take that away from it. But nevertheless, Cinderella is still pretty great in its own right. It may be the most perfect adaptation that this story's been given, even though Cinderella's been adapted so many times, and there are some really great adaptations of it out there. The Rodgers and Hammerstein version comes to mind first, but that's just one example. But I think by putting Cinderella into this animated format, it helps alleviate a lot of the criticism that the story of Cinderella has gotten over the years, because there are some pretty significant plot holes in Cinderella. The fact that the prince and Cinderella spend maybe one conversation together and all of a sudden they're ready to get married. The fact that the only proof the prince requires of Cinderella's identity is the fact that she has the right shoe size, which could be any number of maidens in the kingdom. But having this in animation, you're already suspending your disbelief that these pictures are moving and talking and have life in them. So some of these more romanticized and exaggerated fairy tale ideas become a bit more plausible when you're dealing with talking mice. And that's not to say Cinderella doesn't still have a lot of those plot holes, but the movie does such a great job at sucking you in with the emotion of the situation, of the abuse, and the likability of Cinderella, where you're not too concerned about the logistics of the world because you're just wrapped up in this romantic fairy tale, which is exactly what it's supposed to be. And a lot of the credit does have to go to the incredible voice cast that they got for this movie. Eileen Woods voices Cinderella, and she may be the best Cinderella that we've ever had, even though she's just a voice, because not only does she sing the songs very pretty, and not only does she have a very soothing voice, she's got a surprising amount of sass and a bit of a hot temper, especially when it comes to how the stepsisters and her stepmother treat her. And it does wonders for the likability and relatability of her character, because even though she's in this terrible situation with the stepsisters and stepmother just pouring on all these chores, making her feel like a servant and not part of the family, she's still able to get a few quips and jabs under the radar where sometimes they don't even notice that they're kind of being insulted. And even though she doesn't do anything too insubordinate out of obvious fear of whatever the consequences might be, she does have her limits, and she'll just remove herself from the situation and then vent to her mice and dog and horse and animal friends about whatever she's so frustrated about. And the combination of the animation on her face, which is surprisingly good given the time period, along with Eileen Wood's voice, it really comes together to create a surprisingly well-rounded character, which is kind of unusual for Disney princesses. Usually you think of Disney princesses as being this one-note idealistic dreamer, but no, Cinderella has a good deal of personality that I think a lot of people overlook or just forget exists. But it is there in this movie. And speaking of the voice cast, we have to talk about Eleanor Audley as Lady Tremaine, the wicked stepmother. She owns this character so much that Lady Tremaine has become one of the high-ups in the pantheon of Disney villains. And she's not a sorceress. She's got no powers. All she has is complete control over one person's life. And to Cinderella, she might as well have these powers. And the way Audley plays her as this cold, calculating, manipulative stepmother really does reflect that. It's very rare for Disney movies to have a human villain with no powers to be elevated to this kind of level of fame or infamy, really. And Lady Tremaine gets there, and it's not just Audley's voice, it's also the beautiful animation that they do with her, the way that she scowls and smirks and gives that really intense, frightening stare at Cinderella. It's these images that really sink into your subconscious and remember her as such a menacing presence, even though, again, she has no powers, and she only really has control over one person's life. And that just speaks to just how great a villain they've created in Lady Tremaine. And I wish I could say the same about the Wicked Stepsisters too, but they're more goofy and awkward than actually threatening. And while they serve the role fine, and they do get a few good laughs, especially during their music lesson, they don't do anything particularly horrific except for when they tear apart Cinderella's dress. That is just cruel and horrible. And I'll tell you, as a grown man watching it just the other day, I may have shed a tear for Cinderella during that scene. And I don't know if it was the intensity of the music, the dramatic lighting, just the really harsh, ripping sound, Cinderella's expression, the sister's expression. And it could also be just the amount of build-up getting us to that point where she presents her dress that she made, or rather that the animals made for her because she was so busy with the chores. I don't know, but it all came together to give such a powerful moment of defeat for Cinderella, and that really is her lowest low. You really feel like all of her hopes and dreams have just been dashed. But now let's talk about the mice, because this was the thing that I was the most worried about revisiting it, because I was thinking, are the mice just going to feel like filler? That they had to use them to pad out the runtime and give the mice little side quests to go on to make it just feel longer. And while that's probably the reason why the mice have so much screen time in this movie, it doesn't feel like filler. The quests that the mice go on directly impact the narrative at hand. Early on, when the mice are going out to find scraps of clothing and beads to help make the dress, that is helping make the dress, which Cinderella needs. And at the end of the movie, they're the ones trying to get the key to unlock Cinderella, who's locked up in the tower. Is that why everyone associates being locked in a tower with Disney? You know, Shrek did it, and Shrek was just a big parody of Disney. But Disney had never really done Rapunzel up to that point, and no other Disney princesses were really locked in a tower. But now that I think about it, Cinderella kind of was. Even though it wasn't a castle tower, it was just a chateau, but she was pretty high up there and, again, locked. So I guess that's where it came from. The more you know. But going back to the mice, having them directly impact the narrative makes them feel a bit more relevant. So when they cut to the mice, you don't feel like you're missing out on the more interesting Cinderella stuff. And on top of that, the mice stuff is just hilarious. Doc and Gus Gus going against Lucifer had me cracking up. And I have a feeling this was Disney's response to Hanna-Barbera's Tom and Jerry. Because aside from the obvious of a cat chasing a mouse, a lot of the same slapstick and cartoon violence is used. And it's done with its own Disney flavor, which I appreciated. It didn't try to go all in on the Hanna-Barbera style, but it's still funny. It's still really good Disney slapstick that will definitely be expanded upon more in Peter Pan. I'll talk about that movie's genius slapstick when I get to it, but here you really do get a sense that Disney's really trying to tighten up their slapstick timing just to take their comedy to the next level. And speaking of taking things to the next level, the art direction of Cinderella is something that I really want to talk about, because this is the big theatrical debut of Mary Blair. Now, Mary Blair has worked on many Disney projects before, even theatrical ones, but all of the stuff that she's done previously were package films or war films, and she never really had a full-on hour-and-a-half long narrative to tell until Cinderella. If you don't know who Mary Blair is, she was credited as the head of color and styling for a lot of the Silver Age of Disney, including Peter Pan, Alice in Wonderland, and a few others. She uses a lot of bold, contrasting colors to really give a sense of a mood or an atmosphere, and her work is also very angular and directional. And in something like Alice in Wonderland, that can create a very chaotic atmosphere. But here in Cinderella, it's very refined and pulled back and brought to just the elements that need to be exaggerated to give the most emphasis. And in Cinderella, it's really apparent during the ball sequence, or really any sequence in the castle, because the castle is just all vertical all the time. And if you look at the king's chambers, look at the size of his door or the size of his bed. Like, this is just so grand in scale. And when Cinderella arrives at the castle and she's greeted by all the guards and she has to go up all those steps, everything is so big and epic, and the grandness of it really helps to contrast against the relative ricketiness and falling apart chateau that she lives in, so that when she goes to the ball and she sees all these amazing things, it almost feels unreal, like it's a dream. And all of this works to create an emotional response out of the audience, because the thing with fairy tales, especially Disney fairy tales, is the more that they can elicit an emotional response from you, the less you question the logic of the world, the logistics of the world. And for a traditional fairy tale, you need that because, again, a lot of it doesn't really make sense when you think about it. But that's not the point of Cinderella. Cinderella is a story of wish fulfillment, of having one night where you get to escape your humdrum life to be someone else, do something grand, and then be given the opportunity to make that fantasy a reality and live that life. But of course, none of this wish fulfillment would have happened without the help of the fairy godmother. And for a character who only gets one scene, she really leaves an impression. And that's mostly thanks to the voice of Verna Felton. She has that kindly, matronly voice, but also with some authority behind it. That's why she's been used in so many other Disney projects. She was in Dumbo. She was the Queen of Hearts. She played another fairy, Flora, in Sleeping Beauty a little bit later. But here as the fairy godmother, in the one scene that she has, she really does shine. She, of course, sings the Bippity Boppity Boo song, which is insanely catchy and will probably not leave your ears for a while. But also something I forgot is when she's doing all these miracles, she's turning mice to horses, pumpkin to a carriage. She's doing all these things, and all the while Cinderella's trying to get her to change her torn up dress into a nice dress, probably because they're outside at night and it's probably a little cold and drafty there, but the fairy godmother doesn't catch on. She's doing all these things and then she almost puts her into the carriage until she finally realizes that she's in rags, and her reaction,
dear, good heavens, child,
is just incredible. But I was surprised that she only got that one scene, because most other adaptations try to either bring the fairy godmother in a little earlier to kind of foreshadow it, or bring her back later in the finale. But here she only shows up for one scene, does the song, does the miracles, and then pieces out. And you know, I'm okay with that, because this telling of Cinderella moves at a brisk pace. It gives all the information that you need. It's very simple, it's very emotional and impactful, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. It knows exactly what it is. It's a short little fairy tale told to the best of their ability to get the most impact and resonance with the audience. And if that's what they set out to do, I'd say they accomplished it 100%. And I think the box office agrees with me, because this was a major hit at the box office and got Disney back on track to making more and better animated features. Because after the hits and misses of the Golden Age and then the government-funded projects of World War II, Disney wasn't entirely sure if it was in the cards for them to keep making these very expensive animated movies if they weren't going to make returns in the box office. But luckily Cinderella did, and it ushered in a new era of very successful Disney movies known as the Silver Age. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Cinderella? Do you think it's held up for what it is over the years? Or do you think it's too outdated and oversimplified and too fanciful? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.